In a lawless town where a woman's worth is weighed in whiskey and coin, a quiet rancher wages a war of wills against a degenerate gambler for the freedom of a girl who carries a fire in her soul, igniting a love as wild and untamable as the West itself. The air in the Dust Devil saloon was thick enough to choke on, a foul cocktail of cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and the suffocating arrogance of men who believed they owned the world. At a scarred table in the back, under the sputtering glare of an oil lamp, Jedediah Vance slammed his cards down. His grin was a greasy smear on his face. "Full house, you dogs! Read 'em and weep," he slurred. A chorus of curses met his triumph, but one man, a pig-eyed brute named Silas Croft, leaned in, his voice a low growl. "That's fine for coin, Jedediah, but your coin ran out an hour ago." Jedediah's eyes, webbed with red veins, darted to the corner. There, bathed in shadow, sat his daughter, Elara. "I've still got a stake," he rasped, a cruel glint in his eye. "My Elara, 17, a hard worker." Croft's eyes narrowed, a predator's focus locking onto its prey. The cards were dealt again, and across the room, a man named Kane, who had said nothing all night, slowly pushed himself off the wall. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. Part 1. The Devil's Bargain. The silence that followed Jedediah's offer was heavier than the smoke-filled air. It was a silence of shock, of morbid curiosity, and for a few, dark amusement. Elara felt it press down on her, a physical weight. She was no stranger to her father's casual cruelty, to the way he looked at her as a burden or a tool. But this was a new depth of degradation. She was a wager, a pot to be won. Her future, her body, her very being, reduced to the turn of a card. Croft, the man who held her father's debt, licked his lips, his gaze crawling over Elara like a slug. "Your daughter?" He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "For a month, you say? To work off your tab?" "If I lose," Jedediah muttered, refusing to meet Elara's pleading eyes. "She's yours. Do what you will." "Papa, no," Elara whispered, the words a fragile prayer in the den of wolves. Her voice was swallowed by the raucous laughter and the clumsy banging of the piano. She might as well have been a ghost. "Sit down, girl," Jedediah snapped, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and authority. "You're part of the game now." Elara's world narrowed to that table, to the greasy cards slipping through her father's trembling fingers. Each snap of a card on the wood was a nail in her coffin. She wanted to scream, to shatter the bottles on the bar, to claw her way out into the night. But she had learned long ago that in a world run by brutes, a woman's noise was an invitation for more violence. So she froze, a statue of silent terror, watching her life being gambled away. Across the room, leaning against the far wall near the swinging doors, was a man who seemed carved from the shadows themselves. He hadn't played, hadn't drunk, hadn't spoken. His hat was tipped low, casting his face in mystery, but Elara had felt his eyes on her earlier. Not like the others, not with hunger or pity, but with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He was a still point in the swirling chaos, his presence a silent question mark. His name was Silas Kane, though few in the town of Dry Gulch knew it. He was a rancher from the high country, a man who kept to himself, his silence often mistaken for weakness. It was not. The final hand was played. Croft's triumphant roar echoed in the saloon as he laid down 3 aces. Jedediah's face crumpled, the smugness draining away to reveal the hollowed-out coward beneath. He shoved his chair back, avoiding the sight of his daughter. "She's yours," Jedediah slurred, waving a dismissive hand. "Take her." Croft stood, his shadow falling over Elara. He reached for her arm, his fingers like fat, grubby sausages. Alara flinched, her body rigid with a terror so profound it stole her breath. This was it, the end of her world. But then, a voice cut through the din. It wasn't loud, but it had the gravelly weight of river stones. "She's not property." Every head turned. Silas Kane had moved from the wall, stepping into the lamplight. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was more menacing than any sudden threat. His face, now visible, was stark and weathered, his eyes a piercing, pale blue that seemed to see right through the grime and bravado of the room. Croft sneered, his hand still hovering over Alara. "This ain't your business, friend." Kane didn't look at Croft. His gaze was locked on Alara, a silent communication that sent a jolt of impossible hope through her. He stopped beside her, a solid, unmovable presence between her and her new owner. "She is not yours to take," Kane said again, his voice calm, yet carrying an absolute finality. "And who the hell are you to say?" one of Croft's cronies spat. Kane didn't answer with words. He reached into the inner pocket of his dusty coat and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. He didn't slam it on the table. He placed it there, a gesture of quiet, unshakable power. The top paper was a legal deed, yellowed and stamped with the territorial seal. "I'm the man who just bought this saloon," Kane stated, his voice even, "and every bottle of whiskey, every crooked table, and every outstanding debt in it, including yours, Croft." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he turned his piercing gaze to the brute. "Your debt to Jedediah is now a debt to me, and I consider it paid." He then looked at Jedediah, his eyes filled with a cold contempt. "As for your debt, that's a different matter." Finally, he turned to Alara. The hardness in his face softened almost imperceptibly. "The saloon is closed for the night, and Miss Vance is leaving." He looked directly at her. "With me." A collective gasp went through the room. Jedediah stared, his jaw slack, stunned into a rare silence. Croft looked from the deed to Kane, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Alara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This quiet stranger, this ghost from the corner, had just bought her freedom with a piece of paper and a voice that held the authority of a landslide. He hadn't raised a fist. He hadn't drawn a gun. He had simply rewritten the rules of their rotten game. Part 2. The Ride to Juniper Pass. For a long moment, Alara remained frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with the seismic shift that had just occurred. 1 minute, she was chattel, a piece of flesh to be claimed. The next, a quiet stranger had declared her free. The transition was so abrupt, so impossible, it felt like a dream she would soon wake from. "Let's go, Miss Vance," Kane said again. His voice was not a command, but a steady invitation. It was the certainty in it that finally broke her paralysis. She took a hesitant step, then another, her worn shoes making no sound on the sawdust-covered floor. She did not look at her father. To look at him would be to acknowledge the years of quiet betrayals that had led to this ultimate one. To look at him would be to see the pathetic, broken man who had sold his own blood, and she didn't have the strength for pity or for rage. She had only a vast, hollow emptiness where her love for him used to be. She followed Kane, this silent, enigmatic savior, through the swinging doors of the saloon and out into the cool, embracing dark of the night. The air outside was clean, smelling of dust and distant rain, a stark contrast to the foulness within. It felt like her first breath of true air. The town of Dry Gulch was settling down, the sounds of life muted, as if it, too, was holding its breath, watching them. Kane led her to a pair of horses tied to a rail. One was a powerful roan, his own mount. The other was a gentler-looking mare. He untied the mare with efficient movements, his hands sure and capable. Who are you?" Elara finally managed to ask, her voice raspy. He turned, and in the faint moonlight, she could see the lines etched around his eyes, lines that spoke of sun and hardship, but also of a deep, abiding calm. "Name's Silas Kane," he said, his voice losing some of its hard edge. "Folks call me Si." He handed her a thick wool blanket that had been rolled behind his saddle. "I keep to myself, mostly. But some things can't be left to stand." "You bought a saloon," she whispered, the words still tasting of disbelief. For me." Kane swung up into his own saddle with an easy, fluid motion. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something else in his pale eyes. Not pity, but a fierce, protective fire. "I didn't pay for you, Miss Vance. No man has that right. I paid to stop another man from thinking he did." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. No man has that right. In her 17 years, no one had ever suggested she had rights. She was a daughter, a worker, a burden, a wager. But a person with rights? It was a foreign concept, a language she didn't speak. He offered a hand to help her up onto the mare, and his touch was brief, impersonal, yet sent a strange warmth through her. As she settled into the saddle, he draped the blanket over her legs. They rode out of Dry Gulch, leaving the faint lights and muffled sounds behind them, heading west toward a horizon crowned with the first glimmer of a rising moon. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling as she clung to the saddle horn. "Got a ranch," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her. "Up past Juniper Pass. It's a quiet place. You'll be safe there. You can stay as long as you need to figure out what's next. And then?" "Then," he said simply, "you decide." The simplicity of it was staggering. No demands, no expectations, no hint of repayment, just space, a gift more precious than gold. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. Kane rode beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. He didn't pry or ask about her past. He didn't boast about what he'd done. He simply existed next to her, an anchor in the disorienting sea her life had become. As the stars blazed to life in the vast, ink-black sky, a question that had been burning in her finally broke the surface. "Why?" she asked, her voice small against the immense silence of the plains. "Why me?" Kane was silent for a long moment, his profile a stoic silhouette against the starlight. She thought he might not answer. "Because," he said at last, his voice rough with an emotion he kept tightly leashed, "I saw the fire in your eyes when you looked at your father. It wasn't just fear, it was defiance. And I know what it is to be owned, to have your name and your future decided by lesser men." He turned his head slightly, and his gaze met hers in the dark. It was intense, electric, a connection that went beyond words. "I figured a fire like that deserved a chance to burn free." A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. "I didn't know it was still there," she confessed. "Now you do," he said. And in that moment, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, Elara Vance realized she wasn't being taken somewhere new. She was being returned to herself. And the quiet, intense man riding beside her was not just a savior. He was a kindred spirit, a soul who recognized the wildness in her because he carried a wilderness of his own. Part 3. A Shelter of Silence and Storms. They arrived at the ranch as dawn was breaking, painting the eastern sky in fragile shades of rose and gold. Mist clung to the hollows of the hills, giving the place an ethereal, untouched quality. Kane's ranch was not grand, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. A modest cabin, built from hand-hewn logs that glowed warmly in the morning light, stood nestled in a grove of aspens. A curl of smoke was already rising from its stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the pale sky. "This is it," Cain said, his voice softer here, in his own domain. "Juniper Pass." Elara dismounted, her body stiff and aching from the long ride. The cabin, the sturdy fences, the vast, quiet land stretching out in every direction. It was all so clean, so honest. It was the antithesis of the saloon. She ran a hand over the porch railing. It was smooth and solid under her touch. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Most of the time." He nodded, leading the horses toward a well-kept barn. He moved with a sense of purpose, a man in his element. "It suits me." He showed her inside the cabin. It was as simple and clean as the outside. A main room with a cast-iron stove, a sturdy table, and shelves filled with books, and a smaller room off to the side with a narrow bed. It was a space built for solitude, yet it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Cain laid a fresh set of linens on the small bed, which he indicated was for her, and placed a basket of apples on the windowsill. His gestures were practical, devoid of fuss, yet they were the kindest gestures she had ever known. "You're safe here," he said, pausing at the door before heading out to tend to his work. "That doesn't mean you owe me a thing. Not for the ride, not for the roof. Nothing." He met her eyes, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Understood?" She could only nod, her throat tight with an unfamiliar emotion. It was gratitude, so immense it felt like grief. The first few days passed in a haze of quiet routine. Elara slept more than she had in years, deep, dreamless sleeps, free from the fear of a heavy hand on her door. She found a rhythm in the simple chores of the cabin, sweeping the floors, tending the small kitchen garden, the work a balm to her frayed nerves. Cain was a constant, steady presence. He rose with the sun, worked his land with a tireless energy, and returned at dusk. He never crowded her, never watched her with expectation. He simply shared his space, his food, his silence. But the silence between them was not empty. It was charged, alive with unspoken things. Elara found herself watching him as he worked, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sun-browned forearms, the powerful lines of his back as he chopped wood. There was a raw, untamed grace to him, a stark masculinity that was nothing like the brutish posturing of the men in town. It was in the way he gentled a nervous horse, the focus in his eyes as he mended a fence, the quiet competence in everything he did. She felt a strange, fluttering heat in her chest whenever he would turn and catch her looking, his pale blue eyes holding hers for a moment too long before he would give a slow nod and turn back to his work. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain lashed against the cabin in furious sheets. Elara, who had always been afraid of storms, found herself standing at the window, mesmerized. Cain came in from the barn, soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He shrugged off his wet coat and stood by the fire, the flames flickering across the hard planes of his face. "You're not scared," he observed, his voice a low rumble beneath the roar of the thunder. "I used to be," she admitted, turning from the window to face him. "My father, he hated them. He'd get drunker, meaner." Cain's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but the anger in his eyes on her behalf was more eloquent than any words of sympathy. He moved to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt, as real and potent as the lightning outside, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her heart hammering against her ribs. He saw it. His eyes darkened, the storm outside now reflected within them. He took a step closer, the small space of the cabin suddenly shrinking, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the weather. "Ilara," he said, her name a rough whisper on his lips. It was the first time he had used it without the formal Miss Vance. She couldn't speak, could only look up at him, her breath caught in her throat. He was so close now, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the rain and wood smoke on his skin. It was an intoxicating, dangerous scent. "What you went through," he started, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "What he did to you. When I saw you in that saloon, so defiant and so terrified, something inside me broke." He reached out, his calloused hand gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a brand against her skin. "I wanted to tear them all apart with my bare hands." "You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," he said, his eyes burning into hers. "I just opened the cage. You were the one who flew." He leaned in, his face just inches from hers, and the wild, passionate love that had been simmering beneath the surface of their quiet lives finally broke free. "And God help me, Ilara. I've wanted to do this since the moment I saw you." He didn't crush his lips to hers. It was a slow, deliberate claiming, a kiss that was both a question and a declaration. It was tentative at first, then deepened as she responded, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. It was a kiss of shared solitude, of recognized fire, of a connection forged in silence and now exploding into a storm of its own. It was not gentle. It was raw, desperate, and utterly consuming. A kiss that tasted of rain and coffee, and a freedom so fierce it was almost painful. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small cabin, a far more powerful one had just been unleashed. Part 4. The Ghost of Yesterday. The kiss shattered the careful silence they had built between them, replacing it with a humming, vibrant intimacy. It was a line crossed, a truth acknowledged. They were no longer just a rancher and the girl he'd rescued. They were a man and a woman, drawn together by a force as elemental as the land itself. The days that followed were filled with a new, charged awareness. Glances lingered, touches became less accidental, and the quiet spaces were now filled with a palpable, simmering passion. Their love was not a thing of soft words and gentle promises. It was wild, forged in the harshness of their pasts. It was in the way Cain would stop his work and watch her from across the field, his eyes possessive and tender. It was in the way Ilara would bring him water, her hand lingering on his as he took the cup, a silent conversation passing between them. They found their language not in poetry, but in shared labor, in the rhythm of the ranch, in the fierce, hungry kisses they stole in the dim light of the barn or by the crackling fire at night. It was a love that was being built, plank by plank, like the cabin itself, solid, real, and meant to withstand any storm. But the ghosts of the past are not so easily banished. A month after Ilara's arrival, a rider came up the pass. It was a boy from Dry Gulch, his face pale with fear. He handed Cain a crumpled letter and refused to stay, galloping away as if the devil himself were at his heels. Cain's face was a mask of stone as he read it, his jaw tight, the muscles in his neck corded. Ilara came to stand on the porch, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. She knew before he spoke. "It's from him, isn't it?" Cain nodded slowly, his pale eyes like chips of ice. He didn't try to hide it from her. "Jedediah. He's back in Dry Gulch. He's gathered some of Croft's men. He's calling them collectors. He wants me back," she stated, the words tasting like ash. The old fear, the one she thought she had buried, stirred within her. "He wants to make sure you know he still owns you," Cain corrected, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He's spreading stories. That you're a thief. that I'm a criminal who abducted you. He's twisting the law to fit his narrative." Ilara wrapped her arms around herself, a chill settling deep in her bones. "He put me on a card table in front of a room full of men. What else does he think he owns?" Cain turned to her, stepping into her space, his large hands coming to rest on her shoulders. His touch was grounding, a shield against the encroaching darkness. "Men like him don't care about the truth, Ilara. They only care about power. Your defiance made him look weak. He can't let that stand." His thumbs stroked her shoulders, a gesture of both comfort and resolve. "He says if you don't return to town willingly, he'll come here to claim his property." A wave of fury, hot and cleansing, washed away her fear. It was the fire Cain had seen in her, now stoked by the love and freedom she had found with him. "I was his daughter," she said, her voice hard as flint. "And he threw me away. He has no claim." "You don't have to face him," Cain said, his voice low and intense, his eyes searching hers. "I can take you further west. We can disappear. Start over where no one knows our names." She looked up at him, at this strong, silent man who was willing to abandon everything he had built for her. The depth of his devotion was staggering, and it was that love that gave her the strength to do what she knew she must. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I've spent my whole life running, hiding, being silent. If I run now, he will always own a piece of me. He will always be the ghost that haunts us." She placed her hand over his on her shoulder. "This time, I don't run." A slow, fierce pride dawned in Cain's eyes. It was the answer he had hoped for, the one he had known she would give. "Then we don't run," he said, his voice resonating with hers. "We stand, together." That night, the passion between them was different. It was not just a release of pent-up desire. It was a forging of an alliance, a sealing of a pact. In the dark of the cabin, with the wind whispering through the aspens like a warning, they came together not as two separate people, but as a single, unified force. Their lovemaking was fierce, desperate, a declaration of war against the world that had tried to break them. They were claiming each other, branding their souls with a love that was now their strongest weapon and their most impenetrable armor. As Ilara lay in his arms afterwards, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she knew she was no longer the frightened girl from the saloon. She was a woman who had found her strength, her voice, and her love, and she would burn the whole world down before she let anyone take that away from her. Part 5. The Reckoning in Dry Gulch. They rode into Dry Gulch 2 days later. They did not sneak in at dawn or dusk. They rode down the main street at high noon, the sun beating down on the dusty square. Ilara wore a simple blue dress, her head held high, her back straight. She rode beside Cain, not behind him. They were a united front, their presence a silent challenge to the town that had been a spectator to her humiliation. As they dismounted in front of the general store, the town seemed to hold its breath. Doors creaked shut, faces appeared in windows, then vanished. The silence was thick with judgment and fear. Then, the doors of the Dust Devil Saloon swung open, and Jedediah Vance stepped out onto the porch. He was flanked by Croft and another hard-faced man. Jedediah had a bloated, self-righteous look on his face, the look of a man who has convinced himself of his own lies. "Come to your senses, have you, girl?" he barked, his voice carrying across the square. "Ready to come home and beg forgiveness?" Ilara felt Cain tense beside her, a low growl rumbling in his chest. But she put a hand on his arm, a silent signal. "This is my fight." She stepped forward, her gaze locking onto her father's. "I've come to watch you fail, Jedediah," she replied, her voice ringing with a clarity that stunned the onlookers. "I am not your debt. I am not your property, and I am not your silence anymore. Croft took a menacing step forward. You heard him, girl. You belong to him. Before Croft could take another step, Cain moved. He wasn't fast, but he flowed like water, positioning himself between Elara and the men. He didn't draw his gun, but his hand hovered near the worn leather of his holster. You lay a hand on her, he said, his voice deadly quiet, and you'll pull back a bloody stump. The town square was utterly still. The tension was a physical thing, a wire pulled taut to the breaking point. You think one quiet rancher and a mouthy girl scare me? Jedediah blustered, though a flicker of fear showed in his eyes. These men collect what's owed. Then they'll leave empty-handed, Cain stated. It was then that the courthouse door opened, and Judge Rollins, a weary man with the weight of the law on his shoulders, stepped out. What is the meaning of this disturbance? He demanded. Elara turned. Her moment had come. She faced the judge, but she spoke to the entire town, to the faces in the windows and the figures lurking in the doorways. The meaning, Judge, she said, her voice resonating with power, is that a month ago, in that saloon, this man, my father, wagered me in a game of cards. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. He lost. He sold me for a gambling debt. The judge looked at Jedediah, his face grim. Is this true, Vance? It was just bar talk, Jedediah scoffed. Nothing binding. She's my blood. She's ungrateful. Was she your legal dependent? The judge pressed. Did she consent to be wagered like cattle? Blood does not override the law, Judge Rollins declared. He then turned his stern gaze on Cain. And you, sir, what is your part in this? My part, Cain said, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's, was to offer Miss Vance a safe haven when her own father abandoned her. She came with me of her own free will. She is a free woman. A free woman, Jedediah spat, his face turning purple with rage. She's a liar, a harlot who ran off with this stranger. That was the moment the fire in Elara truly erupted. She strode right up to her father, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that made him take an involuntary step back. I may be many things, but I am not a liar, she seethed. And you are a coward. She spun around to face the crowd. All of you, you were there. You watched. You saw him lay down the cards, and you saw him point to me. Your silence made you complicit. Your silence was his weapon. Are you going to let him use it again? A heavy silence fell. Then a voice cut through it. I saw it. It was Mrs. Hemmings, the tailor's wife, stepping out from her shop. He traded her like she was a sack of flour. I saw it too, the blacksmith added, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. One by one, other voices joined in, a chorus of truth that washed over Jedediah's lies. The town, shamed into action, was finally finding its conscience. Jedediah looked around, his face a mask of disbelief as his power crumbled. He was no longer a righteous father claiming his due. He was just a pathetic gambler, exposed and alone. Judge Rollins pointed a finger at him. There is no case here. There is no debt. There is no claim. Leave this town, Vance, before I have you arrested for public indecency and false accusation. Defeated, humiliated, Jedediah scrambled for his horse and rode away in a cloud of dust, a small, pathetic figure shrinking into the horizon. Elara stood in the center of the square, the silence returning, but this time it was a silence of respect. She felt Cain's hand on her shoulder, his touch both a comfort and a declaration of pride. She turned to him, and the love that passed between them was a visible thing, a light in the dusty square. She had not just won her freedom, she had claimed it, with her own voice, her own courage, and the unwavering strength of the man who stood beside her. She leaned into him and whispered for his ears only, "Let's go home." Part 6. Forging a Future. The ride back to Juniper Pass was different. The silence was not one of healing, but of peaceful triumph. The weight that had settled on Ilara's shoulders for years had finally been lifted, not by Cain, but by her own strength. The land itself seemed to welcome them, the aspens shimmering like gold coins in the afternoon sun, the air crisp with the promise of a future they would build together. That evening, they didn't speak of what had happened in town. They didn't need to. The victory was a quiet, solid thing between them. Instead, Cain mended a squeaky hinge on the porch door, while Ilara baked cornbread, its warm, comforting scent filling the small cabin. It was the simple, domestic rhythm of a shared life, a life that felt more real and profound than anything she had ever known. Later, as they sat by the fire, the flames dancing in the hearth, Ilara traced the grain of the wooden floor with her toe. "He'll never be sorry," she said softly. Cain looked up from the piece of leather he was tooling, his expression thoughtful. "Some men think their silence makes them strong," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But it's just fear wearing a man's boots. I was afraid of him for so long," she confessed, looking into the fire. "Even when I hated him, I was still afraid." "It's not strange," Cain said, putting his work aside and giving her his full attention. "It's human, but you're not afraid anymore." She looked at him then, at his strong, calm face, and the love she felt for him was so immense it was a physical ache in her chest. "Because of you," she whispered. "You gave me a place to stand." "I just pointed you to the ground that was already yours," he replied. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Ilara Vance." In the weeks that followed, their love deepened, settling into the earth of the ranch like the roots of an old oak. It was a wild, passionate thing, but it was also steady and true. They worked side by side, their days filled with the hard labor of the land, their nights filled with a fiery tenderness that left them both breathless. Ilara discovered a talent for carving, shaping small pieces of scrap wood into intricate leaves and birds. It was a way of giving form to the beauty she was now able to see in the world. One evening, Cain came back from a trip to a neighboring ranch with something in his hand. He was almost shy as he presented it to her. It was a small box he had carved himself. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft velvet, was a simple silver ring, hammered into a shape that resembled a winding vine. "It's not fancy," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "but it's steady, like I aimed to be, with you." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes as she looked from the ring to his face. "You don't talk about love much, Silas Cain," she said, her voice thick. "No," he agreed, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "I'd rather build it." She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. It was not a chain or a claim. It was a promise, a symbol of the life they were forging together, a life built on respect, passion, and a shared, untamable spirit. "I'll wear it," she whispered, "because it comes from hands that never once tried to hold me down." He stepped forward, his large frame eclipsing the firelight, and pulled her into his arms. He held her not with possession, but with a reverence that made her feel cherished. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that spoke of home, of forever, of a love as vast and wild as the western sky. "I'll stay," she murmured against his lips. "Not because you owe me," he finished for her, a familiar refrain that had become the bedrock of their relationship. "No," she said, pulling back to look into his piercing blue eyes, her own filled with a fierce, unwavering love. "I'll stay because every single day you choose me, and I choose you. Above them, on the mantelpiece, sat her latest carving. It was a silhouette of two figures, a man and a woman, standing side by side, looking out at a wide, open horizon. They were not holding hands, but their shoulders were just touching, a small point of contact that implied a universe of connection. It was their story, carved in wood, a testament to a love that didn't need to be loud to be heard, a love that had grown not in a manicured garden, but in the wild, open spaces where only the strongest things survive. The future was no longer a terrifying void, but an open frontier, a landscape of possibility they would explore together. Elara Vance, the girl who was once a gamble, had become the master of her own fate. She had learned that true freedom wasn't the absence of chains, but the courage to forge your own key. And true love wasn't about being saved, but about finding the one person who gives you the space to save yourself, the one who sees the fire in your soul and isn't afraid to stand close and feel the heat. Their story became a quiet legend in the high country, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, the most beautiful, wild, and resilient things can grow. A love story not of princes and princesses, but of a quiet cowboy and the untamable girl who taught a whole town the meaning of a woman's worth. We hope you were touched by this tale from the untamed West. If you believe in stories of courage and the enduring power of the human spirit, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with others. Your support helps us keep these Wild West stories alive.